environmental lecture presented by the environmental group of the American Chemical Society Pittsburgh local section. And this local section, this lecture series is also co-sponsored by the Calgon Carbon Corporation. And I'm your host, Rong Hong Lin, member of the ACS Pittsburgh local section and also chair of the environmental group. Joining. The environment group is a topical group within the local section, and we support various activities, including this lecture series, to promote the deeper understanding of science, technology, and our environment. The lecture is being recorded and will be available online soon. And I'd like to remind everyone that the views and opinion expressed in this lecture and any future lectures are solely those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the ACS Pittsburgh local section. And our speaker today is Dr. Rita Geary, a professor of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Geary obtained his PhD from ETH Zurich, Switzerland, and has held faculty and visiting research positions in several universities and research institutes in the US and Europe, including Purdue University and the Argonne National Laboratory. Dr. Geary is a fellow of the Mineralogical Society of America and the Geological Society UK in London. And he's an honorary member of the Mineralogical Society of Slovakia, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Upper Alsace in France. He's an editor of the Journal of Petrology and the chief editor of European Journal of Mineralogy. His research interests include earth materials, their response to geological forces, and their interaction with the environment and humans. And he's also engaged in research projects around the world and is dedicated to promoting the health of our fragile planet through teaching, mentoring, and research. In today's lecture, Dr. Geary will be discussing tire abrasion particles in the environment. With that, please join me and welcome Dr. Rita Geary. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I hope you enjoy the lecture. Thank you. And Dr. Geary, you can take over. I stop sharing here.
All right. Thank you very much, Rong Hong, also for inviting me to this speaker series. And I'm very excited to be here and share with you some of my research and the topic. Let me see. Do you see my screen?
Yes. But in the presentation mode, it's not.
Huh. Okay, you see the presentation mode.
Yeah. So you probably have multiple screens, right?
Yes. Let me take.
Yeah. When you share screen, you have to click the one screen show the presentation.
Yeah. See. Now, do you still see presentation slide?
Not yet.
I wonder. Let's try again. I wonder why this is not working. Do you see my screen now?
The same thing. That's.
Okay, let's see. I wonder why. Let me stop.
So when you click the share, you probably see several screens. You have to click the screen.
Yeah, I don't see. This is strange. I'm now only on one screen. And now.
Oh, yeah, now it's good.
All right, perfect. All right, so I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about tires, and that's a material that many people don't think about. And yet most of us use cars, for example, or even planes. And I would like to talk a little bit about the environmental problems of tires. And there are two major problems that I just want to briefly mention. The first one is every person in a developed country, on average, throws out one car tire per year. That is a lot of tires. So in the US alone, that's over 300 million tires per year are discarded, and we have to deal with, with this waste material. And but today I want to talk about the second issue, which is the little particles that are actually abraded from the tires, and this is the ultimate reason why we have to replace our tires after several years, because the tires, and I hope you see my mouse here, the arrow. So the profile of the tires is getting abraded. And so, of course, that means these particles are disappearing. And once the profile is too low, we have to exchange the tires. So let's talk about these tire particles. And these tire particles are one of the primary components of what is known as non-exhaust emissions. And you all know that we are trying to reduce our exhaust emissions, hopefully to zero in the near future using electric vehicles. But what is not changing, however, is the non-exhaust emissions. So even if we change the entire fleet to electric vehicles, we still have non-exhaust emissions. And that includes brake wear. So each time you hit the brakes, for example, your brake pads will be abraded and you emit particles shown here in this orange circle. Also, when you drive on the road, you abrade the road surface. So these road wear particles, they accumulate on the road in road dust, and so they are shown in this gray circle. And finally, the third type of non-exhaust emissions are tire wear particles, so what we abrade from our tires. Now, when these particles are emitted onto the road, they often combine. So for example, the brake wear particles combine with road wear or road surface particles, and so they form mixed particles which end up in the environment. And when you have tires very often contain both brake wear and road wear particles. So what ends up in the environment on the right-hand side is not just pure tire particle, but it's actually something we call tire and road wear particles, and they end up in the environment. So it's a mixture of rubber, road wear particles, and brake wear. And so this is what I want to focus on today. Now, when you drive a car, the material of the tire that is in contact with the road is actually the tire tread. And this diagram just illustrates some of the components of a tire. So the tread, this is the profile portion of the tire. This is what's getting abraded, and that's why we have to replace it regularly. And the inside of the tires is quite complicated. And we're not talking a lot about this, but just one important caveat is tires become better and better, which means they have more and more ingredients. And of course, these tires are produced by companies that don't tell you what's in there. So if you want to know what's in a tire, you have to actually analyze it yourself. So what we are talking about is these abrasion particles that are coming from the outermost part of the tire, the tread, right? So, and it is important we understand what is in a tire. On the left-hand side, you have a diagram showing an average car tire and the composition of that in weight percent. And what you see in gray, these are polymers, basically, natural and synthetic rubber. And then it also, a normal tire contains quite a bit, about 30% or so by weight, of fillers. These fillers are mostly made of carbon black and silica, nano-sized particle aggregates that are adding stability to the material. And 16%, as you see on an average car tire, is made of fibers and wires. So for example, steel wires or nylon, textiles, things like that. Again, adding stability to a tire. And then something we will come back to, 14% by weight are made of chemical additives. And as mentioned before, what is actually ending up in the environment is not the entire tire, but actually we abrade particles from the tread. So what is more important in our context is what is the chemical composition of the tire tread? And that's shown on the right-hand side here. And you see about 50% or so are made of rubber, both synthetic and natural rubber. About 25% of fillers, so carbon black and nano silica, and 24%, which is a large amount of chemical additives. So the tire tread has a different composition. Most importantly, we don't have fibers and wires in most cases. And also, we have a significantly higher amount of chemical additives in there. So because there's 50% of rubber, we also have to be aware of the fact that these are actually plastic particles that we emit. And in fact, these are called primary microplastics because they're smaller than 1 millimeter. That's typically the definition for microplastics, although some definitions go up to 5 millimeters. But the latest definition is less than 1 millimeter. So we emit microplastics, and they're called primary microplastics because they are emitted in that form, in that size. So it's not like your plastic bottle that is disintegrating into the environment and then creating microplastics. These would be secondary microplastics. So importantly, tire abrasion particles are classified as primary microplastics. Now, an important fact is that the emission factor, so in other words, how many milligrams of microplastics or tire particles are emitted per driven kilometer, so per vehicle kilometer, that is very strongly depending on the size and the weight of a vehicle. And you see this nice in the diagram here. So an average car tire, or a car, emits about 100 milligrams of tire particles per kilometer driven. So that's 1 gram per 10 kilometers. That's quite a high amount if you think about it. And you see with increasing weight or size, we can go up to almost 1 gram per kilometer if you think of a truck. So the heavier vehicle, the more you emit. And this is important because if you think about electric vehicles, they won't have exhaust emissions, but they will actually have non-exhaust emissions. And in fact, electric vehicles are typically considerably heavier than combustion engines, which means that, in fact, not only proportionally will the tire wear emissions go up, but actually the absolute quantities will go up because they're heavier. Another important fact is that these relationships between heavy and light vehicles is maintained across all different types of roads. So, for example, in an urban road, we have the highest emissions, and that's true for all categories of cars. Again, of course, the trucks emit most. If you're on a rural road, all of these categories emit less. So that tells you also something, that the driving style emits the amount of particles that are emitted. If you always have to start your engine, drive around curves, and brake again, you emit more tire particles than if you have, a leisurely drive on a rural highway, for example. So heavier particles emit much more than light particles across the board. If we consider the data that are available for the world, and you can see from this map, we don't have data for all the countries, but we have quite a few data points for different countries. And what you see here is that in the US, we emit per person about 5 kilograms every single year. So each one of us emits about 5 kilograms per year. We have the unfortunate record if you compare to the world. European countries also have high emissions, but about 2%, 2 kilograms per person per year. And then other countries have less. And for all the other countries that are shown in gray, we do not have data. Of course, this depends on various assumptions. These are estimates based primarily on a paper that was published in the Netherlands by Kohler. But it means that overall, if we estimate or extrapolate across the world, overall, we emit 6 million tons of tire particles per year, all right, globally. This is quite a number or a high value. Now, these particles, they are not just staying on the road. And this diagram shows you where the particles end up. So about 10% of the particles that are emitted here on the surface end up in the atmosphere, right? So we have an exchange between the road surface and the atmosphere. But most of these particles are actually distributed across the environmental compartments that you see here via the road runoff. So this is the most important distributor of road dust, and with road dust, of course, they contain tire particles. So imagine of the 6 million particles, more than 5 million tons of particles are distributed across the environment through road runoff. And the road runoff, depending on how the system is set up, it goes directly into the soil, entering vegetation. The best solution, obviously, would be if we connect the road runoff to wastewater treatment and only then release it to rivers and lakes. But in many cases, it's going from the road straight to the aquatic environments, ending up in the ocean. And of course, then fish and other organisms ingest these particles, and it comes up the food chain. Right. So this is basically how these particles, these 6 million tons of tire particles, are distributed in the environment, with road runoff being the most important one. So let's think of oceans. And you all have heard of the enormous amounts of microplastics in the oceans. And when we look at specifically the sources of these microplastics in the oceans, you see that about 30%, roughly, of the microplastic particles that are discovered in the oceans are derived from tire particles. So we're not talking about a minute contaminant in the environment. It is a major portion of the microplastics in the oceans. And you see it's the second highest source after basically washing machines, where you emit mostly fibers. So these 28% of the total 1.5 million tons of microplastics per year in the ocean, this is roughly 400,000 tons of tire particles in the ocean per year, right? Again, these, of course, are estimates, and they're very hard to get, but the estimates range between about 270 and about 900,000 tons per year, tire particles alone, right? So let's remember that the ocean microplastics that we can collect, about 30% of those are actually tire particles. So we're talking about a major environmental pollutant. Because it is such an environmental pollutant, we have to know more about these particles. So what I want to show you now is how do we actually characterize this? What you see here is a sampling station along a German highway. Here is what is known as a passive sampler. So there's no pump in here, but we can collect air samples, basically particles in the air. And the air is flowing through this sampler, and it's passively collecting inside this collecting device. The air goes in here. It is not a turbulent flow. It's a laminar flow in here, very quiet environment. And then the particles settle, according to Stokes' law, on a collecting plate. And this is how we get access to it. So this is a little bit in more detail. You see here the opening slits here. This is where the air goes in. And inside we have a very calm environment, and the particles settle down here. And this is specifically designed, this passive sampler, for particles greater than 2.5 micrometers. So these are coarse particles, if you like. In the air pollution terminology, these are coarse particles. Anything larger than 2.5, we can actually determine quantitatively. So at the bottom of this device, we have a collecting plate, and you see inside here now, this is a sticky plate. There's a glue on here that collects everything that is actually settling via Stokes' law inside this cylinder. And once it is on this plate, we can study it with microscopes. So typically we use optical microscopes, so polarizing microscopes in transmitted light. And when we do that, we can easily identify tire particles. And you see down here a scale bar, 50 micrometers. And this is a very typical air sample from, actually, this is from a village that is supposed to have clean air, right? It's one of those spa towns in Europe. What you see here are different types of particles. This has been stained, so this is actually pollen from a plant. Then you have over here on the left, do you see my mouse, my arrow? Okay, so what you see here, this is a crystal. This is from soil. There are various crystals here. And then you see soot particles, these little particles here, these are soot, or I should say soot aggregates. And then here is a beautiful tire particle here. And you see this is 50, 60 micrometers across. So that's a typical size for a tire particle in the air, right? We can then use other types of microscopy, for example, scanning electron microscopy. This is a typical tire particle. And what you see here, first of all, the scale bar, 20 micrometers. And you see they are typically elongated in shape, and their surface is peppered with other particles. So what you see, these bright particles, they have a high backscatter electron contrast. So these are soil particles, different types of soil particles. It could be quartz, it could be feldspars, it could be micas. And then what is dark gray is the actual rubber. So what you see here is exactly that we have particles that are encrusted with foreign materials, picked up from the street surface, from the soil, from agricultural areas around the road, or it could be breakware particles. So this is what a typical particle looks like. We can go in and actually quantify these. Let me see here. This is another image of a typical tire particle. You see it's a backscatter electron image. Again, everything that is bright is not rubber. So the particle is shown here, the outline. And we can go in and actually analyze individual particles. And what you see here, everything that is in green that is called quartz. It's a mineral quartz, SiO2. Then in blue, that's a feldspar. And the pink is also feldspar. So calcium, potassium, aluminum silicates, very typical soil minerals or geological materials. And we have some undefined silicates. These could be micas, for example. But we also have calcite, so calcium carbonate. That really depends on the local environment, the geology, but also, of course, on the road surface. So if your road is made of cement or concrete, the particles that are embedded or in the crust on the tire particle will be very different. Now, another interesting thing is these are images of tire particles from different roads. The left two images are, again, these are now, first of all, the little images are transmitted light microscope images. You see, that's why they're opaque, typical elongate shape. And the big pictures are the tire particles in backscatter electron images and in different roads. On the left-hand side, you have a highway where cars have very high velocities and the fluid traffic. In the middle, you have also a highway, but you have very often traffic congestion, plus a very high proportion of trucks. And you see that the encrustment with particles on the rubber is actually different. And on the right-hand side, you have a city road where you have low velocities and constant stop and go with traffic jams. And you see here we have a much higher proportion of matrix and only a few particles on top on the surface that are literally glued into the surface. And so basically what that shows you is traffic patterns also influence what the actual tire particle looks like. We can become very quantitative and look at different particle size ranges. So the same roads again, this is the high traffic, fluid traffic, high velocity highway. And you see here, brake wear shown in orange, tire wear in black, and road surface in gray. And you see, depending on the size on this highway, you change the proportion of the different particles. So for example, because we have fluid traffic, we do not have a lot of brake particles in the coarsest particle size fraction. On the other hand, if you go to the very right-hand side, this is the low velocity city road where you have constant traffic jams. You have no coarse brake particles because the trucks, they don't really have to brake hard if they stop. They drive very slowly and you don't have large brake wear particles, but you have a lot of small particles from brake wear. And you see the size and the traffic patterns, the traffic patterns and the grain size changes with different roads. So different fluid, different traffic patterns have a major impact on what is present on these tire wear particles. So it is important that we know that, because tires, and especially these tire wear particles that are a mixture of road wear, brake wear, and of course rubber, they will end up in the environment. And as I've shown you, they are distributed across the environment. So we have to now be also concerned what happens once they are in the environment. Well, these tire particles, they will degrade. They will degrade because they're exposed to UV light, they're exposed to moisture, they end up in rivers, in lakes, in the ocean. So in these environments, they will undergo degradation or weathering. And therefore, we have to know what's in there to find out what's being released during weathering. And so let's talk a little bit about tire and road wear particles. Why are these particles a concern? In fact, we are very much worried about the toxicity. And there are more and more studies that show that tire particles are actually, or can be, extremely toxic to various organisms, because we can easily inhale or ingest these particles. If we are living near a bus stop, or if you're waiting for the bus at a bus stop, these particles are in the air, you inhale them very easily. Children can ingest them when they play. So these are the main mechanisms how these tire particles can enter organisms, various organisms. And now once they're in there, or just also in the environment, the degradation can actually release various chemicals. And there are several chemicals in tires that are of concern. First of all, zinc. Zinc is a major component. Typically, it's about 1 weight% in an average tire, and it's an element that is added as a vulcanizing agent. Then we have another very important and abundant component is butadiene, and butadiene is the major component of synthetic rubber, but it's also a carcinogen. So it has been shown that it's a carcinogen. Meanwhile, we emit that by driving a car, or driving a truck, or a bus, or landing with a plane on a runway. So we emit major amounts of butadiene into the environment. Then inside the tires, as I mentioned before, there are various chemical additives. And for example, benzothiazoles are a very common additive. They are used as accelerators and activators for chemical reactions during production. There are many different species that are added. And the important thing here is to remember that this is what is added. Once it's degrading in the environment, you can transform these additives into other components due to UV photochemical reactions, or also just simple weathering. So what is actually released to the environment may not be the original substance. Another substance that is very common in tires, sometimes in rather high concentrations, is 6-PPD. I don't know if you have heard of this chemical. It is an important antioxidant and antiozonant, because tires have to be protected once they are out there in the environment. They are exposed to sun and high levels of ozone. So we need something that protects the rubber formulation. And 6-PPD is one of those components. Various studies have shown that once it's in the environment, it is degraded into other components. Some of these are actually really toxic and deadly to fish. Perhaps you have heard in the Pacific Northwest, every year during salmon migration time, there are mass killings of salmon because they are on the receiving end of road runoff, and it has been identified as the main source are tire particles. So it's something of concern. Then PAHs are present in tires, sometimes in large amounts. That's part of the production feature, including the addition of carbon black. And finally, we also have, of course, various components that are derived from the brake abrasion particles, because brake pads contain a whole range of elements, including barium, antimony, and copper, but also lots of iron. They are present in the brake pads, and they are released. And as I mentioned before, they will become part of this cover. It's like an encrustment of the tire particles once they are on the road. So it means that all these components can be released during the degradation of these particles in the environment, or if you ingest it, or if an organism ingests it, during digestion, right? So physical, chemical, or microbial digestion can release any of these components or all of these components. So of course we have to be concerned what's happening, or what are the effects. In fact, especially benthic organisms, so organisms that live in the sediments of rivers and lakes or estuaries, they are foraging through the loose sediment. And it is there where a lot of these tire particles are deposited. So for example, shrimp have been shown to ingest large amounts of tire particles. You can actually see it because they are transparent. And they also excrete it again after digestion, or major portions of that. But it means that when you eat shrimp or certain fish, but especially shrimp, you very well may ingest tire particles along. So the question now is, since these are real pollutants of concern and they will not go away anytime soon, even if we change the entire fleet to electric vehicles, what can we do to reduce the emissions of such particles? Well, first of all, they are emitted because our tires are degrading over time. So what we would like to have are tires that they are less susceptible to abrasion. So the tire engineers are very busy trying to figure out better formulations of tires that last longer. And there are various attempts. Some are close to being commercially available. These are so-called self-healing materials. So when there's a little cut in the tire, it doesn't lead or not necessarily lead to breaking off of that little particle, but it can actually self-heal. So extensively higher abrasion resistance. That's one of the goals that the tire engineers are working on. The second thing that is also in test phases is to add little devices on the car behind the wheels that would actually trap these tire particles before they reach the road. So that means they would be less contaminated with road wear particles, less contaminated with brake wear particles, but they will not be free of these particles. All right, so they are still a mixture of road wear and brake wear and tire, but still we would emit fewer particles to the environment. So that's a relatively easy technology that we can apply to wheels, right? And it would reduce the emissions. Another attempt is to reduce or to substitute some of the chemicals that are present, especially the toxic ones, with less toxic chemicals. And I don't necessarily mean, the silica or the carbon black, they have their own concerns. And we have much better materials that we can use, and the tire companies are trying to find more sustainable ways to replace that. What I'm talking about here are the chemical additives. So, for example, do we really need the benzothiazoles that when they decompose, they create these toxic components? Do we really need 6-PPD, or do we have less toxic components? So we are talking about these materials. Obviously, if we can reduce the silica or the carbon black, that will be another added bonus, but there's much more research available to that, and I think there's a promising path. And then there's something all of us can do, or the cities can do. We can have much better traffic management systems. And so, for example, as shown in this picture, we would like to have a situation that is not looking like this, so that you drive for 100 meters, 200 meters, and there's another red light. You have to stop. You go again, another 100 meters, there's another red light. So we want to have a fluid traffic system with automated traffic lights that will be green for a whole period, so that you don't have to stop and brake and start your car again. This is where most of the particles are emitted. So we want to have stretches of 2-3 miles that the lights are green for certain periods, and we have a fluid traffic flow. This is easily manageable. And of course, you also want to drive differently, so that driving habit is something that every single person can improve. So an important part of reducing emissions is actually education of drivers. So for example, there are tires that are much more abrasion resistant. And if we include or actually add labeling of how many particles, how many milligrams per kilometer are emitted, that could help you choose the right tire. You would choose a tire that emits much less than another tire, which may be cheaper. But that's part of the consumer education. We should change our habits in driving. So when you see crazy drivers in the cities, and I live in Philadelphia, we have our fair share of crazy drivers, they race from one red light to the next, and they hit the brakes. This is exactly this driving habit that increases the amount of tire particles that are emitted. And then finally, we also have to educate the consumers that the exhaust emissions are not the only thing we have to worry about. We have a lot of non-exhaust emissions as well that we have to think about. So that's on the emission side. We also can improve on the emission side. So basically, how much is ending up in the environment. So, and there are different attempts that are being tested today. First of all, there are test areas where porous asphalt is used. They actually trap tire and road wear particles, so fewer particles are emitted into the environment. They are stuck in the road. So that's one attempt. And the other attempt is that in certain hotspot areas, for example, in certain very high traffic or traffic jam areas in cities, you rinse the roads so that you remove them from the road surface so that they are not further degraded in size, because larger particles are easier to collect than small particles. Once they're very small, it's almost impossible to actually trap them. Then another way to reduce the emissions is improve our storm water management. Because, as I mentioned before, road runoff is the major transport vector for tire particles into environment. So if we have a better storm water management, we can reduce transport of these particles into the environment. This could, for example, be done by connecting the road drainage systems to wastewater treatment facility, especially in urban environments. Obviously, if we are out, in let's say in the Midwest on a vast stretch of land, this may not be possible. But you could have road runoff management systems by just having a sink where the road runoff will end up near the road in a sink and be trapped there, rather than be distributed across, the fields or into a river. We could trap them along the road with very simple systems. But in urban systems, we should actually deviate or transport what goes into these drainage systems, bring them to a wastewater treatment facility. And I just want to show you one example. This is Philadelphia, one of the major bridges across one of the two rivers, across the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, very close to the university. And I want to show you now, this is during a storm event in September last year. Do you see here the mouse? This is a drainage pipe. Do you see it here? And let me just play the video. It's easy to see. So do you see how the water from the drainage pipe is just coming right straight down into the river? That's one side of the road. And over here, the same thing. You have a drainage pipe, and you see it's coming directly into the river underneath. So there's absolutely no mechanism to trap these particles. And we are in one of the major metropolises. There would be an easy way to connect this to a wastewater treatment facility where we can actually trap these particles before it's emitted into the river. And it's not done. So there are ways to do a better job, and we don't do it for cost reasons. So there's really something we have to change. And with that, I just want to thank my collaborators. There are not too many people working on the characterization of tire wear particles. These are my colleagues, mostly in Germany, but also here in the US. And what we do, we try to quantify how many particles are emitted, and also characterize them and try to come up with better ways to reduce the emissions. We also work with tire engineers. And so what is important is that in the last 2-3 years, there's an enormous interest in this type of material, and there are more and more toxicologists. And maybe in the last 2 years, there were probably about 50-60 papers that started to do toxicological tests on tire wear particles and on various types of organisms, mostly fish, but also with cell cultures, to test the toxic effects of tire particles. And it's something we really have to do. And the EPA is now even considering limiting certain types of chemical additives to tires. So we are on the right track, but we are far from going there. And the tire companies, for now, are still not doing their share in the toxicology. They try to become more sustainable, but they don't talk much about the toxicology of the basically end product in the environment. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to try to answer your questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting talk. Very interesting. So now we open for questions since we have a small group. So if there's any question, you just unmute yourself and speak up. So regarding the toxicity of those emissions, so you have the rubber, filler, and chemical additives. So do we know which one is the major like a contributor to the threat to human?
The answer is no. The answer is no. Quantitatively, I would imagine it's butadiene because it's a major component of the rubber part in terms of quantity that is released, but I'm not sure that it's the most concerning chemical. Right now, most of the attention is on the benzothiazoles and the PPD. That's where most people work on. And also, I want to stress not just on these components that are added, but are actually on the derivatives that are formed in the environment. So in a way, this is similar to if you think of pharmaceutical products, we don't just have to test the toxicity of these pharmaceutical products, but also of the metabolites and of the metabolites once they enter the environment, because then they are basically exposed to air, ozone, UV, and so on. So, and these chemicals, they are very quickly photo-dissociating into other materials, which we also have to test for toxicity. So it's very complicated.
All right, Christine, you have a question? Christine, we cannot hear you. I guess you are muted. Christine, we still cannot hear you.
Sorry, I lost
that's okay.
I lost the connection. Did we hear from Christine?
Yeah, I saw to raise his hand, her hand.
Oops.
Yeah, you are unmuted, actually. Or maybe you can post your question in chat box. Can you type your question in the chat box? Yeah, Kristen, there's a next to your name, there's a microphone icon you can click and unmute yourself. Yeah, I guess you are unmuted and no, we still cannot hear you.
Can you type the message?
Yeah. Yeah, while we're waiting for a question from Christine, and do we have any other question from the audience? Oh.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can read your question. So I personally have not worked with that, but in the Netherlands, they have significantly lower emissions than in other European countries because the Netherlands has developed this type of asphalt that is porous, and therefore it seems to trap these particles quite considerably. So I don't have enough data to say that, but if you look it up, I think you should find data on that. So that would definitely help. But of course, it means after a while, these pores of the asphalt will be full. And then what? What do we do then? Do we have to remove that surface cover that basically then contains a lot of rubber or tire wear particles? And I'm not sure how they actually plan to do that.
Okay, so you mentioned about the distribution of the particles. So initially, some of the particles were going to go to air.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have any idea, like quantitatively, like how much will go to air? Because at least I never thought about, oh, there's emission in the air, like from the air, those dust. We usually care about, oh, the emission from the exhaust, right?
Yes. So yes, basically the way it goes into the air is not, I mean, a small portion might go directly, but most of it is actually resuspended road dust. So, the road dust accumulates, and that's a mixture of road surface, it be soil, it be tire particles, brake wear particles, and so on. But let's say the road dust accumulates, and next time you're on a road, have a look at it along the curb. You see the road dust, and so when let's say a truck drives by, it resuspends, right? So the road dust will be resuspended, and that's how it gets into the atmosphere. And the estimates are about 10% of the mass will be emitted into the atmosphere, basically through resuspension, or wind, for example, can also lift it off.
Okay, another question about the degradation. So compared to other polymer products like those water bottles and others, those how this tire particles degrade compared to those other particles.
Thank you. This is a really important question, and I can't give you an answer. We know very little about that. I know that one colleague of mine down at the Citadel in Charleston, he tried to do, or he's still running experiments in the soil. So he has test soils with tire particles and leaves them in there for a couple of years, and then sees what happens. Digs them up and measures various parameters in the soil. So we are really at the beginning. We don't understand it yet. So the most easily accessible would be in river water. But so we are actually, one of my students will try to do some tests in synthetic rainwater in the laboratory. But then we will start with maybe 1 week, 2 week, maybe 1 month if possible. But that's about it. Within a PhD thesis, you can't really several years of experiments. But so we'll try to do that in the laboratory.
We have a follow-up question from Christine.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes. So what do we do with these collected emissions once, if we manage to trap them? Well, we can recycle tires. So a major portion of the discarded tires are being recycled into other things. For example, floor mats, or for like children's playground, or floor mats for in your laboratory, in offices and factories. So that's how it can be done. So yes, we could actually recycle these. It's not an easy material to recycle from what I understand, but I'm not an expert in this. Unfortunately, a lot of the discarded tires are in the US ending up in landfills, and in Europe and Japan, for example, the tires are actually combusted. They are incinerated as secondary raw material, also alternative raw material, primarily in the cement manufacturing, because they can buy it for cheap. So it's an alternative fuel. They have, they get carbon credits because it's a waste material, and tires have an extremely high heat content. So it's an efficient fuel source, and the ash can be integrated into cement. So there are various benefits of incinerating old tires. In the US, there were, I think, 3 in total waste tire incinerators, so dedicated incinerators, because you need special air pollution control devices. But to my knowledge, they all went bankrupt. So it's a logistical problem. You have to, transport the discarded tires to a central facility where you then burn them. So I think that was the main reason.
So that means this type of like a strategy is not economically feasible?
Unfortunately, it is. Some coal-fired power station, they do co-combustion of coal and tire particles, actually shredded tires. And so it's actually quite common in the US, co-combustion. The problem there is these coal-fired power plants have not been designed to burn tires. And
I see. Yeah.
if you have ever seen a car tire burn, it's really, really black smoke.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
In one of your slides, you showed that the different type of those particles, and one is about the city dust. What's that? The city dust. What kind of like particles
Yes.
follow that category?
Yes. So that slide was just microplastics in general. So one part from cities very common is road dust, road paint marking. So road markings, they contain a lot of plastic. Like the yellow and the white lines. And as we drive, we abrade them. That's why they have to replace them, and that ends up in the oceans as well. And then it's kind of an undefined category. Anything plastic in the city, ends up in the road or somewhere else, and it disintegrates to form plastics. So a lot of industrial processes will release plastics in the city.
We have another follow-up question from Christine.
Oh, yes. Thank you for this question. I didn't mention that. Yes, tires for trucks are different in composition because they have to be stronger. But to my knowledge, but I'm not a tire expert really, in the manufacturing, but to my knowledge, the sidewalls of truck tires contain lots more titanium and also zinc. It's just they have to be stronger because of the loads, but the exact differences I do not know. And it's difficult to get the data. But yes, cars are made and all for airplanes too. And that's an understudied topic. How many, or what are the amounts of tire particles emitted from aviation? And if you next time you're on an airport, look at the black mark on the runways where they land. I mean, each time I don't know how many milligrams or grams are basically emitted when planes land. So around airports, you probably have a lot of tire particles in the soil, but it's very poorly studied. And those tires are again different.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? All right. If not, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Really
you.
Enjoyed your talk and very nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you, and have a good day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.